The fluorescent strip above the operating theater hummed like a distant engine as Chi Wan measured time in heartbeats and sutures. Her hands moved with that quiet economy surgeons earned over years. Too much to think, just precise motion. The patient on the table had been brought in bleeding, half-conscious, a jacket still mud-streaked over his shoulders. Emergency images told of shrapnel and blunt force. Someone had said military in the corridor, and there had been officers at the threshold, faces taut with procedure rather than panic. That was when she saw the watch. It lay on his wrist beneath a torn cuff, polished brass dulled by blood and grit. A simple thing, a small face with a cracked crystal, and a scrap of leather strap looped awkwardly. She paused. The watch was ordinary, but not common. An heirloom type, the sort a schoolboy would tuck away in a secret pocket, the sort that clung to memory. In the brief exchange of looks with the anesthetist, Chi Wan felt a pulse of recognition she could not name. "Stable enough for debridement," she said. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to make decisions when outcomes were life or death. "Prep for OR2. Foley, blood cross-match, full. Notify family liaison. Whoever brought him, we need a name." The man under sedation had hair that fell across his forehead in a deliberate sweep, a jaw that suggested someone who had been taught not to smile too widely, the kind of austerity the military trained into posture. His cheekbone bore a pale scrape. When the mask had lifted as they moved him, there had been a name on a field tag, Gu Jingze. Then an officer's voice, clipped and deliberate, giving orders and repeating the name like a word to be anchored. Chi Wan worked without theater for the identity of the man. The hospital took in bodies and names like a harbor, and for a night she was a lighthouse, cutting, pressing, finding the exact point where life and loss separated, and tending to the fragile rope between. He bled, but not disastrously. The worst injuries were to his head. The CT had shown a contusion and a diffuse injury that explained the glazed moments of the ambulance ride, the kind of brain insult that could slide words out of place. After she finished closing the last layer and ordered him to ICU, Chi Wan lingered at the bedside, watching monitors breathe numbers. The watch lay wrapped in gauze on a tray beside the bed, cleaned enough to reveal an engraving along its back, a year, a set of characters smoothed by time. She had known that hand once. For a beat, seeing the curve of those letters unmoored her from the immediate present. A childhood echo pressed against her ribs, stubborn and small. She had been 12 when she had first seen a watch like that, on the wrist of a boy who shared an umbrella with her, who had given her a paper crane, and the bright, embarrassingly earnest promise that some things last beyond seasons. The memory was not neatly arranged. It came like flecks of light in rain, partial, warm, and insistently tender. For a moment, Chi Wan allowed herself the thought that the man under the white sheet might be connected to that small memory. And then she nudged that thought away, because it was idle, and because the ICU needed orders, and because there were patients in the corridor who would not wait for private recollections. When she stepped out, the lobby smelled of disinfectant, and someone burnt an overcoat in a vending machine. Outside, rain had started to stitch the night together. The city lights bled into wet concrete. A military sedan idled near the emergency entrance, and an officer approached her with clipped respect, words careful as if saying the wrong thing might open a wound. "Dr. Chi," he said, "family request. He's—" The man faltered, searching a file. He's Gu Jingzhe, second lieutenant. Family indicates high profile. He looked at her, eyes that had learned to measure risk. Please keep them informed. Chi Wan nodded. Standard updates, she said. But this is a trauma case. We proceed by trauma protocol. Notify us of any legal delegation through the liaison. Yes, doctor. The officer straightened, the rain dotting his shoulders. There is someone at the hospital. A woman, claims to be his fiancée. He added the last with a tilt of caution, like a person setting down a jar that might break. Chi Wan turned back toward the sliding doors. The thought of a fiancé pulled an ache across the base of her neck she refused to name. She had carved a life of rules, long shifts, patient lists, careful solitude, and a fiancé was a complication she did not need. Yet there was a quick, inexplicable tightening in her chest when the word arrived at her ears, the way a name could make a wound remember its source. She found the woman in the waiting area, hunched in a rented cardigan, fingers twisted around a paper cup gone cold. She had an unremarkable face, more ordinary than the fashion magazines, worry-folded lines at her mouth. When she lifted her head, her eyes cut to Chi Wan with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed questions. "Doctor," she said, voice thin, "my name is Li Qian. Gu Jingzhe, he's my fiancé. She swallowed, breath catching. "I work at the embassy. They told me." Chi Wan watched the way Li Qian's hands trembled. She recognized that shaking. It was universal. "We're stabilizing him," Chi Wan said. "He has a head injury. From what we can tell, there's a high risk of altered consciousness and memory impairment. When he's awake, he may not recall personal details. That's not uncommon. We'll do our best." Li Qian nodded, shoulders taking a little more of her weight. Will he remember me?" Chi Wan found the question pragmatic and heartbreaking. "Some patients regain fragments," she said. "Some do not. Memory is not like a book you can open at will. It's a map, and injuries can erase roads." A good news is many people rebuild maps with new routes. For now, keep to one voice. Familiar names, familiar objects, those can sometimes anchor recall. We'll notify you of any change. Li Qian pressed her palms together as if in prayer. "There are pictures," she said hurriedly, "old school photos. He keeps them in a box. A watch, it's important to him. The family, they told me to—" She faltered, as if the words had substance she was not allowed to breathe. "They told me to bring the wedding certificate. He wanted—" Chi Wan had expected bureaucratic demands, statements about inheritance or rank. But the way Li Qian named the watch made her heart slow with a resonance she could not place. She asked one professional question. Who brought him in? Unknown. Civilians near the river, Li Qian said. There was an explosion on the bridge. Military were called. He was found unconscious. Chi Wan absorbed the facts into a ledger that went from the public, protocols, documentation, to the private, a watch, a wedding certificate, a woman who clutched memorabilia as if the object might prevent slipping. She had a dozen things to do, but beneath the efficiency, a memory she had tried not to touch crept from the wardrobes of her past. She remembered a boy by a river, not a soldier then, but someone who had spoken to her in the language of small, ardent promises. She made arrangements for Li Qian to see him when medically appropriate, and added the watch under protective custody. Sometimes tactile things, an old watch, the scent of a book, could prod a brain into remembering. She would recommend a structured protocol to the neurologists. It was clinical duty, nothing more. When the patient finally blinked in the ICU, his eyes found the ceiling and then the watch, and then, unexpectedly, Chi Wan. He sighted her with the slow recognition of a man emerging from sleep in a strange room and finding an old friend at the bedside. He blinked, the pupils adjusting, and his lips formed a name that wasn't there. Wan. He tried and stopped. A frown pinched his forehead, muscles that had not been used for a tender expression. Who? Chi Wan felt fingers of heat trace up her arms and gather at her throat. She steadied herself. "Dr. Chi Wan," she said softly, because in the sterile flash of the ICU she had to claim the simple fact of her existence first. "Chi Wan, I'm the surgeon who treated you." At the sound of her name, his eyes sharpened in a manner that belonged to someone who had once kept themselves in absolute reserve. There was a flicker of something, an echo, perhaps, before the blankness returned. "Chi," he stopped again. His voice had a cadence that could have been memory trying on clothing and finding it does not fit. He tried to smile and failed. The ghost of a smile that made his jaw seem stranger, like a man examining a face he no longer recognized. Li Qian hovered by the curtain, fingers pressed around the watch case, as if it were ballast. She leaned in, breath small. "Jingzhe," she said, repeating the name slowly, then offering images. "We met at school. There was a river. You gave me a paper crane. You have a scar on your left knee from soccer." Her speech was an offering. It was the tidy architecture of someone attempting to rebuild a life on a table of facts. Ge Jingzhe blinked, and for a flinch of a second a tear tracked sideways from the corner of his eye, as if a memory had washed up and left a stain. He reached with the attention of someone trying to anchor in present land, and his hand brushed the watch, the movement clumsy with gauze and lines. He did not speak, but a single syllable, "Wan," escaped like a stone dislodged by the tide. Chi Wan's breath came out in a small private gasp that could have been anything: amusement, grief, the ache of recognition that was not yet permission to believe. She let the moment be small. There were scans to run and protocols to follow. She authorized a neurologist consult and recommended a slow reintroduction to personal artifacts. The surgeon in her believed in systems. The woman in her felt 18 again and foolish. Days stretched in the hospital like sheets laid over furniture. Ge Jingzhe's memory arrived not as an all-or-nothing lightning strike, but as a scatter of mothlight, images and phrases that sometimes fit and sometimes did not. He remembered being in uniform. He remembered the discipline of standing at attention, the smell of polish, and the clean, metallic taste of duty. He did not remember why his watch had been engraved with the year and a pair of characters he could not entirely place. He did not remember the particular warmth of a child's laugh, or the exact curve of a face that had once given him a paper crane. When the family arrived in full force 2 days later, they arrived like a storm front. Ge Jingzhe's mother, a woman who moved as if the world were a ballroom and she had the lead, stepped into the hospital with leaves of authority folded into her posture. She introduced herself with the slow, deliberate diplomacy of someone who had run a conglomerate and a household with the same iron acceptability. "Dr. Chi," she said, extending an immaculate card. "I am Gu Lian. My son is in your care." Her voice was a low bell. She did not ask, she asserted. She had the kind of polish that could reflect light off a room like a mirror. "We are doing everything we can," Chi Wan answered, keeping her voice even. "His injury is being monitored. There is risk of retrograde amnesia and confabulation. It is unpredictable." Gu Lian listened as if Chi Wan had explained weather, because weather could always be talked into plans. "There will be an inquiry," she said finally, "and the family must be protected. If our Jingzai's memories do not return, arrangements must be made. Practical arrangements. He had a betrothal, the certificate." The words landed like cast stones. Betrothal, certificate. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era landed like cast stones, betrothal, certificate. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The hospital's neutral lights flared at the edges of the term, like a star that had been found in catalogs. Li Qian's thin hands tightened on the watch. Gu Lian's glance slid toward Chi Wan and settled there with a flavor of calculation. "You are suggesting something," Chi Wan said, "because there are lines a doctor will not cross even when society presses. If by arrangement you mean a legal recognition, that is not a medical decision. If you mean that the family will insist upon something binding while he is incapacitated, you must go through the proper legal channels. We will not facilitate anything that compromises patient autonomy." Gu Lian's cool mask slipped for the smallest beat. She regarded Chi Wan with an appraisal that catalogued lines and possible uses. "We are talking about the well-being of Jingzai," she said. "If memories fail, documents must stand. For his status, for stability." It was a statement about reputation dressed as caretaking. Chi Wan felt the old ache at the idea of legal edicts in place of feeling. "His cognitive state is fragile," she said. "He may not have the capacity to consent to a legal change right now. That is for legal counsel to assess. We will inform the guardianship office if necessary." Gu Lian's smile did not quite reach her eyes. "We know law," she said. "We will act in the family's interest." Her tone left room for unspoken methods. Wealth, pressure, an older generation's view that marriages were transactions as much as hearts. Chi Wan stood firm. She had long ago learned that other people's authority did not always mean they were right. She had also learned that some fights were not hers to pick. She set a boundary. No legal declarations without evaluation. No coercion in the name of order. Still, when the family left, pockets of quiet gossip followed. Someone whispered that the Gu family would make arrangements, and the hospital, which thrummed with illness and quiet heroism, was not immune to social force. She thought of her own father, authoritarian and small-hearted, and the way power in a household could suffocate. She thought how she had chosen medicine to be apart from those kinds of entanglements. Yet the night in which Gu Jingzai first reached for her name, stitched into a watch and a memory that had not yet remembered itself, she felt as if history, her history, was being invited back into her orbit. He woke into a life he half remembered, as if through a film reel left in the sun. Gu Jingzai found himself in a room that smelled of antiseptic and lemon cleaner, the kind of blandness that tried to make everything neutral. His hands found the edges of his bed, like a man reacquainting himself with the shape of his body. The right side of his head throbbed with a dull, persistent echo. He remembered cadence and formation, the regimented life of the barracks. He remembered standing under training lights and thinking the world could be ordered by discipline. But invitaciones to dinners, to family visits, to photographs with smiling officers arrived like small avalanches. For a woman who had built a life on the exactness of sutures and sound anesthesia plans, it was an unusual brawl. The community from their school days heard of the accident and arrived in different forms. Some classmates, now financiers or socialites, came not as friends but as currency exchange. Curious how a boy who once sat near the river could now be a conduit to status. At the announcement of Gu Jingzhe's recovery, the alumni group organized a reunion under the pretense of support. Under the surface, it hummed with possibilities, old wounds, old jealousies, and the kind of social comparing that never sleeps. Wan Wan, Chi Wan's school friends called her Wan Wan when they were being intimate in memory, received an invitation like a paper with the past stamped on it. It was an evening in a banquet hall where the lights were too bright and the small talk too sharp. She tried to decline, but found herself pulled by the strange gravity of a life she had thought left behind. The reunion was to be a gathering of their cohort, the people who had known them when they were younger and less careful. At the reunion, the room had the sweet antiseptic of catering. Boiled vegetables arranged like little green roofs, champagne pretending to be conversation. Old classmates greeted each other with the practiced affection of people who had catalogued each other's lives online and stored them behind curated filters. There was laughter with the sound of measuring sticks. She had barely settled with a cup of tea when Gu Jingzhe walked in, flanked by a uniformed aide who had the air of someone trying to look light. His face was still a little hollow from convalescence, and his smiles had the awkwardness of someone wearing a mask that might slip. He moved through the room like a man learning to walk again in social environments. The moment their eyes met in the half-light, a hush descended on the corner where they had once been part of a trio that fenced off the world from the weather. Those who saw them together later said something about electricity. Chi Wan would remember only that a piece of her caught and would not unhook. "You look like you could command an army," she said, because that was how she had always made her jokes, abrupt, lightly armored. He looked at her with that laconic patience that made him seem older than his years. "A hospital feels like a campaign sometimes," he replied. "You run triage, and everyone survives or dies by your orders." Wan Wan thought his voice held the same cadence that had once told her secrets by the river. She did not know whether to be angry that he had not sought her out earlier in his recovery, or relieved that the meeting was happening in a space that felt neutral. In that seed lived a rationale for later conflict, jealousy dressed as grudge, a suggestion that other people would act out of insecurity and use the Go family's visibility as a lever. Chi Wan went home that night to an apartment that smelled faintly of tea and a quiet she had learned to manage. She placed the watch in a drawer she rarely used, the one that kept pens and odd trinkets. For a moment she thought of the life at 12, of paper cranes and rain, and of a man who had once said he would remember forever. And she recognized, with a clarity that made her both frightened and oddly tender, that the man she had once known might now be under the sway of terms she did not trust. She steeled herself. If this was to be a life she would touch, it would be on terms she set. No coercion, no papered arrangements behind his back. Tension matured into pressure. The Go family escalated quietly, as only wealth knows how. They set meetings that felt like negotiations and offered veiled promises to those who might advise Ge Jingzhe at his weak points. Li Chan, earnest and trembling, found herself in the middle of a storm she had not been trained for. She loved the man in the way that was sometimes more duty than passion, and that made her vulnerable to the family's practical logic. Chi Wan navigated the hospital's politics with a surgeon's aloofness. She stayed out of family parley whenever possible, but she was not blind to the ways that money bent morals and shaped outcomes. When Ge Lian suggested that they transfer Jingzhe to a private facility where the family would hold sway, Chi Wan bristled. He needs monitoring and a multidisciplinary approach, she argued, not a place where decisions are made for convenience. Ge Lian's smile was neat. "We will provide what is necessary," she said. "We only want him to have stability." "But stability and coercion are different," Chi Wan insisted. "If the family wants to help, fine, but we will not make legal or personal decisions without his informed consent." The family's pressure increased, a slow bruising where the world attempted to shape the man into the image they desired. Ge Jingzhe felt it like a weather system pressing on the chest, leaving him restless. He had not yet forged the muscles to resist family urgency. He felt guilty sometimes for the relief the family offered. Survival had a way of inclining gratitude. Yet he began to sense that the family's plans had less affection in them than calculation. At the heart of the story of these escalating tensions was a small legal wrinkle, a betrothal certificate long kept in a family safe. Li Chan insisted it existed. The Go family insisted it registered intent. Others in the room whispered that a marriage by consent could be arranged officially if Jingzhe was judged incompetent. The thought of other people making life-defining decisions for him like inventory made him clench his hands. He wanted to be the author of his life. Chi Wan, who knew the law in fragments enough to advise her patients, told him in a calm voice, "You have rights. Watch for anyone who would sign away what you cannot understand. Your autonomy, your capacity to make decisions, matters." He looked at her then with a ferocious gratitude that made something in him decide to hold on, not to anything grand, but to a thread of agency. It was a small decision, but sometimes lives turn on small, proper acts. The inciting disaster that would change everything came on a rain-stung afternoon that smelled of mud and electricity. Heavy monsoon weather had swollen the hills outside the city, turning slopes into slippery things with teeth. The construction company run by the old rival had been working on an embankment nearby. A scheduled blast had been pushed forward. Rain had seeped into earth, and earth lost its patience. When the landslide hit a suburb where the Gu family's country villa was situated, the bridge that ran over a small river turned into a mouth. The television helicopters spun with a narrative fever, a collapse, trapped residents, and a list of the lucky and unlucky. Ge Jingzhe felt that familiar old tug of duty. He wanted to be present where his family might be, to prove that he was more than a convalescent patient. He wanted to stand upright and own his life. Chi Wan was on a shift when the first calls came in. An influx of trauma victims, the helicopter pads suddenly thin with the urgent sound of rotors. The hospital activated disaster protocol like a beast shedding skin. Staff moved with a syncopated rhythm. There were no guests in the theater. Reports came in of multiple casualties, trapped civilians, and a collapsed bridge. The news named the Gu Villa, and Gu Lian's calm voice broke into a ragged edge. "This is our home," she said into the phone. All the while the family's lawyers tried to smooth the edges. "We need access." The hospital mobilized a response team for extraction. They coordinated with military rescue units. Gu Jingzhe, feeling a surge of something that might be purpose, insisted on joining the team. He was still technically under observation, but his military training gave him the physical capacity to help on the ground. He wanted to do more than receive sympathy. Chi Wan's heart clenched when she heard he had left the hospital before being fully cleared. She fought the inclination to scold because he was not a child, and because there was the gravity of life to contend with. She found ways to push protocols forward so the rescue units had medical team support at the field. She convinced commanders that a surgeon on site could triage and save lives. The order was risky. It required leaving the safe environment of the hospital for an unstable landscape. They arrived at the scene to a world of collapsed earth, a ribbon of mud and concrete, street lamps like tired sentinels, and families gathered in the rain like small, defiant rituals. The helicopter wash made the air a living thing. Rescue workers moved like a choreography of urgency. Snatch, bandage, carry, repeat. A small boy clung to his mother. A dog yelped as rescuers coaxed it from rubble. The smell of wet earth was strong and merciless. Gu Jingzhe moved through the scene with an almost sacred focus. He had the look of a man who had been built by discipline, and now used that discipline to order chaos. He carried ropes with practiced gestures. He shouted clear commands. He found victims and made paths. He also moved like someone searching the debris for a sense of belonging. If duty were a muscle, this rescue honed it. The rescue teams found a collapsed underpass where the old rival's contractor had been working. Machinery had been misused, instructions misread, and a wall had come down on a work crew. Voices shouted, a light flared, and then the rescue became immediate. Digging with hands, lifting beams, keeping breathing channels open through small, ingenious measures. Chi Wan crawled into a shallow space to clear a man's airway. Her surgeon practiced even when gravity insisted on pushing her pride down. An explosion, a chemical flash as fuel ignited in a ruptured pipe, sent a shock through the scene. People were hurled sideways. The sky opened with a new kind of noise. Dust and steam mixed in the rain. Gu Jingzhe heard someone scream. He found himself pinned by earth for a moment, chest compressed by a slab that had chosen him for its counterpart. A beam pressed into his shoulder. His breathing tightened with a sense of the old fear, the kind that arises when life itself becomes a question. When help came, it did so in the messy, human way of hands and ropes and presence. A rescuer found the pocket of his jacket torn and a scrap of paper with a familiar fold. It was a neighbor who had remembered the Gu family and, out of habit, looked for their insignia in the rubble. In the immediate chaos, hands found hands. The watch, still on Gu Jingzhe's wrist, took a blow, but held. Its face canted toward the rain. Chi Wan crawled into the same crevice, her field experience making her the person to assess his breathing, to tell someone to cut the jacket, to hold the space between panic and procedure. In the squeeze of mud and dust, Gu Jingzhe felt a memory crack open like ice thawing under a river. In the dim of the underpass, there had been the scent of river mud and the sound of a child folding paper cranes. A scrap of a song slipped his tongue. He did not know where it came from. He pressed his thumb to the watch, and, for an instant, a clear image came. A girl with small hands, hair plastered by rain, laughing with an undefended brightness as an umbrella shook above them. The image was sharp enough to hurt. Chi Wan, who was holding a towel to a wound on his side, felt her own memory converge like two streams meeting in a shallow delta. She looked at him and saw him look back. And in that look lay the remnant of a promise they had once made to each other when the world had been smaller. A rescuer's slab cracked with the rhythmic sound of equipment. The patient next to them coughed, alive. It was the truth. The rescue had not been a private duet, but a chorus of people. When the slab was finally lifted and Gu Jingzhe dragged out into weightless air, it was not the hospital's sanitized light, but the emergency floodlight that pinned his face like an insect. Rain ran down his cheeks. The wash of the helicopter's wind stole breath from people who watched as if watching a miracle of practical engineering rather than a theology of luck. He coughed and tried to stand, to find purchase, and in that shaky moment, his eyes found Chi Wan again. People say that crises reveal character. In the slurry of that night, everyone shed pretense like wet clothes. Li Chen moved through the population with a steady hand, helping a terrified child find her mother. Gu Lian barked orders and then burst into tears when they found a neighbor alive. Sauces of ambition and malice tasted bland against the evidence of human need. After the immediate rescue, in the flaring afterlight when ambulances hummed and emergency tents smelled of heat and coffee, Gu Jingzhe sat wrapped in a foil blanket. He did not yet have all his memory, but he had a shard of certainty. In the heat of the rescue, he had recognized Chi Wan as if she were a compass. The sight of her face in the mud, hands scraped, hair stuck to her forehead, eyes like lamps, registered not as a report, but as a lodestar. He reached, slowly, for her hand. It was a small, deliberate act, and the world pressed in and out of breath around it. Chi Wan caught his fingers, the man she had once known, now contemporary and raw. For a second they did not speak. There was no need. "I don't remember everything," he said finally, voice low. "But He stopped, as if the rest might be a confession or a demand. "I remember you by the river." Chi Wan allowed a smile that was equal parts fatigue and something like a bloom. "You always had a bad memory for cartography," she teased. "You meant the map for feelings, not geography." He gave a small, almost embarrassed grin. That grin tugged a thread in him that wasn't about obligation or inheritance. It tugged at something like choice. In the days that followed, the legal tempest that had been assembled by the Gu family found itself interrupted by the clarity of the rescue footage. The cameras had caught moments where Gu Jingzhe acted not like an heir in soft company, but like a man who owned responsibility the way one owns an outfit, with clean, fast lines. He had not only been the subject of family narratives, the rescue had transformed him into someone whose actions would define him. He coughed and tried to stand, to find purchase, and in that shaky moment his eyes found Chi Wan again. People say that crises reveal character. In the slurry of that night, everyone shed pretense like wet clothes. Li Chen moved through the population with a steady hand, helping a terrified child find her mother. Gu Lian barked orders and then burst into tears when they found a neighbor alive. Sauces of ambition and malice tasted bland against the evidence of human need. After the immediate rescue, in the flaring afterlight when ambulances hummed and emergency tents smelled of heat and coffee, Gu Jingzhe sat wrapped in a foil blanket. He did not yet have all his memory, but he had a shard of certainty. In the heat of the rescue, he had recognized Chi Wan as if she were a compass. The sight of her face in the mud, hands scraped, hair stuck to her forehead, eyes like lamps, registered not as a report, but as a lodestar. He reached, slowly, for her hand. It was a small, deliberate act, and the world pressed in and out of breath around it. Chi Wan caught his fingers, the man she had once known, now contemporary and raw. For a second they did not speak. There was no need. "I don't remember everything," he said finally, voice low. "But He stopped, as if the rest might be a confession or a demand. "I remember you by the river." Chi Wan allowed a smile that was equal parts fatigue and something like a bloom. "You always had a bad memory for cartography," she teased. "You meant the map for feelings, not geography." He gave a small, almost embarrassed grin. That grin tugged a thread in him that wasn't about obligation or inheritance. It tugged at something like choice. In the days that followed, the legal tempest that had been assembled by the Gu family found itself interrupted by the clarity of the rescue footage. The cameras had caught moments where Gu Jingzhe acted not like an heir in soft company, but like a man who owned responsibility the way one owns an outfit, with clean, fast lines. He had not only been the subject of family narratives, the rescue had transformed him into someone whose actions would define him. The old rival's company came under investigation for negligence. Little by little, the world rearranged the terms by which people would judge him. Chi Wan watched the shift with a surgeon's eye. Where there had been talk and paperwork, there were now facts, video evidence, eyewitness accounts, the mud under people's fingernails. The bevy of lawyers and orchestrated pressures softened in the face of the raw human proof that Gu Jingzhe had been present in danger and had acted for others. It would not erase the family's attempt to bind him legally if they wanted to, but it complicated their narrative. For Gu Jingzhe, the rescue did something more intimate than public. It opened more roads inside his mind. Images arrived in a kind of compass rose, a paper crane, the whirl of an umbrella, the smell of river mud. They were not full pages, but fragments that insisted on being read together. He sought out old-school photos and asked the archivist to help, and each photo was a small lens that allowed memory to swell a little. At night, in the small hours when the hospital slept, except for intermittent beeping, he and Chi Wan would talk about small things: coffee preferences, the taste of certain street foods, the names of their teachers. Their conversation had no pretense about romance at first. It was a slow, patient stitching. He learned the texture of her working hands, the way she hummed when she focused, the old anger at her father that she kept folded like a letter. She learned the softness beneath his stoicism, the way he could be sharply protective in ways that were not dramatic but practical. He brought extra blankets to the ward. He corrected junior staff with a kindness that felt like insistence. They were not lovers in the tidy sense yet. They were two people learning how to be present. There were moments of awkwardness, Li Qian hovering in the periphery, a family member who still attempted to shape public perception. But the rescue had given Gu Jingzhe clarity enough to resist being a puppet. He began to make deliberate choices, to listen to his neurologist, to ask questions, to tell his mother that he would not be moved without proper counsel. When the day came to sign documents related to his discharge, he surprised everyone by calling for a meeting where he would state his intent in front of council. The hospital conference room watched as he declared he would not be forced into legal arrangements by expediency, that he would make decisions when he was ready to give informed consent. He placed the watch on the table between him and his mother like a talisman. Gu Lian's face hardened in public and then softened in private. The Gu family retreated to reevaluate. They had been used to running on certainty. Gu Jingzhe's sudden claim to autonomy altered their accounting. Chi Wan went home that night and slept like a person who had been given the luxury of a choice.
Mas pela primeira vez em uma longa temporada, ambos sentaram com as mãos desempunhadas, prontos para definirem os termos de seu próprio história.